At the beginning of the movie, we see an American jail where many prisoners are working. We then see a guard named Paul, who is in the washroom. Paul is in a lot of pain right now because he is suffering from UTI. Then another guard arrives, telling him to come out as a new prisoner is arriving there today.
Prisoner. Christ, give me a minute.
Paul ignores his pain and, gathering courage, comes out.
You should have took the day off, going to see the doctor. I think it's clearing up.
Then we see our new prisoner getting out the vehicle. Another guard named Percy brings him inside, and he keeps saying that the prisoner has been sentenced to death, so he will die soon. Actually, Percy likes to harass the prisoners, and seeing others in pain boosts his ego. But this prisoner is no ordinary man and does not look like someone to be messed with. He is so tall that when he enters the prison, all the guards are shocked to see how huge he really is. Now, when Paul asks this new prisoner his name, he tells him his name is John Coffey. And here Paul realized that he might look huge in size, but he is a very cowardly person and acts like a 7-year-old child. He even asks Paul not to turn off the light because he is afraid of the dark. So Paul tells him that the lights always remain on, so he should not worry about that.
Do you leave the light on after bedtime? Because I get a little scared in the dark sometimes.
Stays pretty bright around here all night long.
As Paul starts to leave, John extends his hand towards Paul, even though the guards advise him not to shake hands with John. But Paul shakes hands anyway. Seeing this, the guards start laughing because initially they thought John was a very dangerous person, but he turned out to be a gentle man. Now John says tearfully that he tried very hard to stop it, but he couldn't stop it. Paul doesn't understand what he is saying and goes straight to his office where he tells his colleagues that a person who has absolutely no sense and is a completely simple person has been sentenced to death.
Looks like they sent us an imbecile to execute.
Then Paul looks at John's file, through which we learn the reason for his arrival in prison. Actually, 2 girls went missing from a house, so the father of those girls, along with some people, starts searching for his daughters. Later, when they reach the forest, they find the dead bodies of both girls in John Coffey's lap, and John was repeatedly shouting that he tried very hard to stop it but couldn't stop it. Everyone thought that John killed those girls. That's why John is sentenced to death. The next day, Paul starts cleaning the electric chair because a prisoner is to be seated in this electric chair and killed with an electric shock. Here we learn that only those prisoners who have been sentenced to death are brought to this prison. Paul then hears someone laughing from outside, and when he comes out to see, he finds his colleague laughing at a mouse. That mouse comes in front of them. The guard gives the mouse a small piece of biscuit, and the mouse picks up the biscuit piece and goes straight into the death house cell. Seeing this, they start thinking that this mouse might make a hole in the prison, which could eventually become large enough for a prisoner to escape through. So, they start taking everything out of the cell to catch the mouse. However, after removing everything, they still can't find it anywhere. Seeing this, all 3 start laughing at each other because the 3 of them couldn't even catch a single mouse. The next day, that mouse appears in front of them again, and this time Percy is also there. One of the guards throws a piece of bread toward the mouse to feed it, but Percy throws his stick at it, trying to kill it, but the mouse quickly escapes. Percy then starts chasing after the mouse, but the mouse isn't going to fall into Percy's hands so easily. After making Percy run around for quite some time, it eventually escapes back into the death row cell. Seeing this, Percy gets angry and starts removing everything from the death row cell to catch the mouse. Just then, Paul and his colleague also arrive there. Paul's colleague explains to Percy that they did the exact same thing the previous day, but they still couldn't find the mouse. However, Percy refuses to listen and continues taking everything out of the room. But once again, the mouse is nowhere to be found. Now he has to put everything back inside the death row cell. Frustrated, Percy starts throwing things back inside. Seeing this, a guard tells him that his loud noise is disturbing the prisoners, so he should put everything back quietly. Hearing this, Percy gets angry and starts speaking rudely to that guard. Seeing this, the guard grabs Percy by the neck and pins him against the wall. Percy then threatens him, saying that if he tries to hurt him, he will get him fired. Hearing this, the guard immediately lets Percy go.
You be on the bread lines before the week is out.
We all know who your connections are. You ever threaten a man on this block, job be damned. We all gonna have a go.
Actually, Percy is the nephew of the governor's wife, and he takes full advantage of that. Whenever someone is rude to him, he complains to the governor and gets that person fired. This is why all the guards try to stay away from Percy to protect their jobs. The next day, while Paul is working, he hears someone laughing inside one of the prisoners' cells. When Paul goes there with his colleagues, he is shocked to see that the mouse they have been searching for days is sitting and playing on the shoulder of a prisoner named Dell. Dell is extremely happy to have the mouse and tells the guards that he has made this mouse his pet. According to Dell, the mouse obeys all his commands. To prove it, Dell throws a roll a short distance away, and the mouse runs after it and brings it back to him. Dell then reveals that he has named the mouse Mr. Jingles. Meanwhile, John, who is standing in the nearby cell, tells Dell that his mouse is incredibly smart. After some time, the prison warden calls Paul to his office. Here we learn that the warden and Paul are very good friends. The warden tells Paul that a new prisoner is about to arrive at the prison, and he is extremely dangerous. During a robbery, the man killed 3 people. Because of this, the warden says they need to increase security throughout the prison. Paul notices that the warden seems deeply troubled, so he asks him what is wrong. The warden then reveals that his wife has been diagnosed with a brain tumor. Unfortunately, the tumor is located in a place where surgery cannot be performed, meaning that his wife is going to die soon. As he talks about his wife, the warden becomes extremely emotional. He tells Paul that he doesn't know how he is going to tell his wife that she is going to die. The next day, Paul is waiting at the entrance for the arrival of the new and dangerous prisoner, whose name is William. However, while waiting, Paul suddenly starts experiencing severe discomfort due to his urinary tract infection, making it difficult for him to even stand properly. Seeing Paul's condition, John Coffey, who is standing inside a nearby cell, calls out to him and gestures for him to come closer, but Paul has to deal with the arrival of the new prisoner, so he doesn't go to John. John then warns Paul to be careful. When William is brought inside the prison, he suddenly attacks one of the guards. Seeing this, Paul immediately rushes over to help despite being in severe pain. But William knees Paul directly in the area where he was already hurting, causing Paul to collapse on the ground in agony. However, Paul somehow gathers the courage to stand up and points his gun at William, but William refuses to let go of the guard he is holding. Meanwhile, Percy is also standing nearby. But despite all the chaos, Percy is too terrified to even touch William. Just then, another guard arrives, snatches the stick from Percy, and uses it to strike William. He then manages to free the guard from William's grip and puts William inside a cell. Once everything is under control, the other guards leave. However, Paul remains behind because he is still in tremendous pain. Eventually, he lies down on the ground, unable to bear it any longer. But then he hears John Coffey's voice once again. John tells Paul to come to him because he has something important to do. Paul somehow manages to pull himself together and walks over to John's cell. Suddenly, John grabs Paul and pulls him closer. He then places his hand over the area where Paul is suffering from the infection. Paul struggles desperately to free himself, but John holds him tightly. Suddenly, the light bulb inside the cell begins glowing brighter and brighter. Before anyone knows what is happening, the light becomes so intense that the bulb suddenly shatters. John finally releases Paul. At that moment, Paul realizes that the terrible pain he had been experiencing just moments ago has completely disappeared. Meanwhile, John Coffey starts coughing violently. Then a strange cloud of dark particles comes out of his mouth before dissolving into the air. Paul is completely shocked. He asks John what he did to him and how he managed to cure him so suddenly. John simply tells him that he helped him. After saying this, John falls asleep. Later, when Paul goes to the washroom, he is stunned to discover that he feels absolutely no pain while urinating. His infection is completely gone. After suffering from the condition for months, Paul is finally able to urinate without any pain, and he lets out a huge sigh of relief. Paul can't stop thinking about John. What doctors had been unable to cure, John had somehow healed in an instant. Because of this, Paul begins to believe that John could never have murdered those 2 little girls. He becomes convinced that John must have been framed. Wanting to learn more about him, Paul goes directly to John's lawyer. There, he asks about John's identity, who he is, and where he came from. The lawyer tells Paul that before the day of his arrest, no one had ever seen John Coffey. He was first discovered in the forest, standing beside the bodies of the 2 dead girls. Apart from that, no one knows anything about John, where he came from, or how he ended up there. After hearing this, Paul returns home. Because John had miraculously cured his painful condition, Paul now feels a strong sense of gratitude and affection toward him. The next day, Paul brings John some home-cooked food that his wife prepared for him. John is extremely happy and enjoys the meal. Meanwhile, William also asks Paul to give him some food, but Paul refuses. Frustrated, William spits directly in Paul's face. However, Paul doesn't react and simply walks away. The next day, when Percy is passing by Paul's cell, William suddenly grabs him and starts choking him. Percy, out of fear, wets his pants. Seeing this, Paul immediately rescues Percy at gunpoint. After this, William is taken and locked inside the death row cell. Meanwhile, Percy is extremely embarrassed because he wet his pants. A prisoner named Dell notices this and starts laughing loudly at him, making fun of Percy. Furious, Percy tells Dell that he will definitely take revenge on him. Days pass like this, and Dell's execution day arrives. However, Dell isn't as worried about his own death as he is about his beloved mouse, Mr. Jingles. He keeps wondering who will take care of his mouse after he is gone. One of the guards assures Dell that they will send Mr. Jingles to a circus where he can entertain people with his tricks and live happily. Just then, Mr. Jingles escapes from the cell and starts running through the hallway, where Percy deliberately steps on the mouse, crushing it to death. He then walks away as if nothing happened. When Dell sees his beloved mouse lying dead, he starts crying. Percy, meanwhile, is secretly pleased to see Dell crying. He had killed Mr. Jingles purely to take revenge on Dell for humiliating him earlier. John Coffey, who is in a nearby cell, witnesses this and feels sorry for Dell. He then asks Paul to bring the mouse to him. Paul picks up the dead mouse and hands it to John. John gently closes his hands around it and blows on it. Suddenly, a bright light begins glowing from his hands, just like before. Then, once again, strange particles come out of his mouth and disappear into the air. Everyone watches in complete shock. Moments later, the mouse suddenly comes back to life and runs straight back to Dell. All the guards are left completely shocked. They wonder if they are dreaming or if this miracle actually happened. Meanwhile, Paul goes to Percy and tells him that he is so weak that he couldn't even kill a mouse. Percy thinks Paul is joking and insists that he crushed the mouse with his own foot. Paul then tells Percy that if he doesn't believe him, he should go and check Dell's cell himself. When Percy goes there, he is shocked to see Mr. Jingles alive and well. Meanwhile, the time for Dell's execution arrives. Dell is brought to the electric chair, and this time Percy is put in charge of his execution. Actually, Percy had promised that if he is given responsibility for someone's execution, he will then get transferred away from the prison. He had even applied for a position at a mental hospital. Normally, a wet sponge is placed on the prisoner's head before the electric chair is activated. This allows the electric current to pass through the brain more quickly, causing a faster death and reducing the prisoner's suffering. However, Percy deliberately places a dry sponge on Dell's head. Then the lever is pulled and Dell is electrocuted. Instead of dying quickly, Dell begins screaming in unbearable pain. Paul notices the bucket nearby and realizes that there are no signs of water around it. That's when he understands that Percy deliberately used a dry sponge. Because of this, Dell is forced to suffer terribly before finally dying a slow and extremely painful death. After Dell's horrifying execution, Paul becomes furious. He grabs Percy and reminds him of his promise to leave the prison after carrying out an execution. Paul tells Percy that he must leave soon and transfer to the mental hospital. He also threatens to report that Percy did nothing when William attacked the guards because he was too terrified to help his colleague. Paul further warns Percy that he will tell everyone how he wet his pants when William grabbed him by the neck. Hearing this, Percy finally agrees to leave the prison. However, he has absolutely no intention of keeping his promise. Later, Paul finds John crying. When Paul asks him what is wrong, John explains that he could feel Dell's pain as he was suffering during the execution. He also says that Mr. Jingles could feel Dell's pain as well, which is why the mouse ran away from the scene. Paul doesn't say anything to John, but when he returns home, he breaks down and cries because he is deeply affected by Dell's death. The next morning, Paul invites all of his colleagues except Percy to his house for breakfast. While they are talking, Paul brings up the subject of John Coffey. He tells them that they all witnessed John bring a dead mouse back to life. Paul also reveals that John had miraculously cured his urinary infection. Paul then explains that the warden's wife is seriously ill with a large brain tumor, and the doctors have told the warden that nothing can be done to save her. Because of this, the warden has become extremely distressed. Paul tells his colleagues that there is someone who might actually be able to cure her, and that person is none other than John Coffey. After hearing this, all of Paul's colleagues agree to help. They come up with a risky plan. That night, while all the prisoners are asleep, they will secretly take John out of the prison and bring him to the warden's house. If they are caught, they could all lose their jobs. But despite the risk, they decide to go through with the plan. The following night, they bring bottles of beer into the prison and begin drinking together. William asks Paul for a bottle as well. Paul initially refuses, but after William repeatedly begs him, Paul takes a glass of beer and approaches William's cell. However, Paul has secretly mixed sleeping pills into the drink. Paul tells William that he will give him the beer, but after tonight, he must stop bothering everyone. William agrees. After teasing him for a little while, Paul finally gives him the beer. William drinks it without suspecting anything. After some time, William falls unconscious. The guards then grab Percy and force him into prisoner's clothing. They tie his hands and cover his mouth with tape so he can't make any noise. They lock Percy inside the death row cell so that anyone who sees him will assume that John is still inside. With everything under control, the guards take John out of his cell and begin secretly escorting him outside. But suddenly, William regains consciousness and grabs John's hand. The moment William touches him, John begins trembling with fear. It is as if he can immediately sense the evil inside William. Paul quickly pulls William's hand away from John, and William falls unconscious once again. Once John steps outside the prison, he looks up at the open sky and becomes incredibly happy to see the stars. He also smells the grass, as if he is reconnecting with nature after being locked away for so long. Insmond. After getting in the car, Paul asks him if he knows where they are taking him. John replies that they are going to help a woman. Paul is shocked and asks how John knows this. John simply says that he doesn't know how he knows these things. Eventually, they arrive at the warden's house. The warden immediately comes outside holding a gun because he thinks someone has broken into his home. But when he sees Paul, he calms down. However, when the warden notices John, he immediately points his gun at him. John is a prisoner, and taking him out of prison without permission is strictly forbidden. Paul quickly explains that they have brought John there to help his wife. After hearing everything, the warden finally allows John inside. Inside the house, the warden's wife is lying in bed. Because of her illness, her mental state has deteriorated. John approaches her, and she asks him his name. John replies that his name is John Coffey, like the drink, but spelled differently. John then moves closer to the warden's wife. Suddenly, all the lights in the house begin glowing brighter and brighter. John draws the illness out of the woman's body and into himself. Paul, the other guards, and the warden all watch this miraculous event happen right before their eyes. The warden's wife is completely cured. The warden hugs his wife, overwhelmed with happiness. But this time, something is different. Unlike when John healed Paul and Mr. Jingles, the ash does not come out of John's mouth. Instead, John's condition begins deteriorating rapidly. The warden's wife's illness has now entered John's own body. Meanwhile, the warden's wife is completely healthy. She doesn't remember anything that happened after she first learned about her illness. She looks at John and asks him his name again. Before John can answer, she says it herself, John Coffey, like the drink but spelled differently. She then tells John about a dream she had. In the dream, everything was covered in darkness, but John appeared to her like a light and saved her. Before John leaves, the warden's wife removes her necklace, places it around John's neck, and gives him a hug. The guards then begin taking John back to the prison. By now, John's condition has become extremely weak, and the guards struggle to get him back inside his cell. Once John is safely inside, they bring Percy out of the death row cell. But Percy has realized what happened. He now knows that the guards secretly took John outside the prison. Percy threatens to report them to the governor, telling him that they tied him up, locked him in the death row cell, and secretly took John out of the prison. The guards become terrified because they could lose their jobs because of this. Percy then starts walking away to complain. As Percy passes John's cell, John suddenly grabs him and pulls him closer. John then transfers the warden's wife's illness into Percy's body. Percy's condition immediately begins deteriorating. He starts staggering uncontrollably and eventually walks toward William's cell. He pulls out his gun and shoots William dead. Then Percy collapses to the ground, completely losing control of himself. Paul immediately realizes that this was John's doing. He goes to John and asks him why he did this. John explains that both William and Percy were evil people. When William grabbed John's hand earlier, John could feel the darkness and cruelty inside him. John then asks Paul to hold his hand. He says that if Paul does, he will show him what William had done. Paul's colleagues warn him not to do it, but Paul decides to trust John and takes his hand. The moment they touch, Paul begins seeing everything that John has seen. Paul discovers the horrifying truth. William was actually the one who murdered the two little girls. John had been wrongly accused of their murders. That's why John used Percy to kill William. Paul breaks down in tears as he finally understands the truth. He also realizes why John is always crying. John can feel the pain and suffering of everyone around him, and he has been carrying that burden inside him for his entire life. John tells Paul that this kind of suffering exists everywhere in the world. Paul finally understands just how much pain John has been forced to experience. The next day, the warden is told that William had been constantly harassing Percy, which is why Percy supposedly shot and killed him. Because Percy's mental state is no longer stable, he is sent to a mental hospital. Ironically, this is the exact same hospital where Percy had planned to work after transferring out of the prison. But now, instead of working there as a guard, Percy will spend the rest of his time there as a patient. Meanwhile, Paul is devastated because John's execution is approaching. Paul knows that John is innocent and he doesn't want him to die. He also feels deeply indebted to John for everything he has done for him. The next day, Paul visits John and asks if he wants him to secretly help him escape from prison. Paul offers to take John somewhere far away where no one will ever find him, but John refuses. He tells Paul that he is tired of living in a world filled with hatred and cruelty. He has seen the darkness inside people's hearts, and every day he feels the suffering of humanity as if it were constantly stabbing him from within. John says that he can no longer bear the pain. He wants Paul to execute him and finally free him from all of this suffering. Paul asks John what he will tell God when he meets him. How can Paul justify allowing an innocent man to die when he knows the truth? John tells Paul that Paul isn't killing him, he is helping him. John no longer wants to live in this painful world. One of Paul's colleagues then asks John if there is anything they can do for him. After thinking for a long time, John asks for plenty of food. He also reveals that he has never watched a movie. So, the guards fulfill his final wish and show him a movie together. Eventually, the day of John's execution arrives. The guards bring John to the electric chair and seat him down. A large crowd is gathered to witness the execution, including the parents of the two girls John was wrongly accused of killing. The girl's father stares at John with hatred and anger, shouting insults at him. Finally, Paul asks John if he has anything he wants to say. John says that he is ashamed because he couldn't save the two little girls. A guard then begins placing a black cloth over John's head. But John tells Paul that he is afraid of the dark and asks him not to cover his face. Paul agrees. For the last time, Paul and John shake hands. A wet sponge is placed on John's head and the execution begins. As the electric current passes through John's body, all the guards begin crying. Paul is completely heartbroken as he watches an innocent man die. And finally, John Coffey dies. At the end of the movie, we see an old man watching the same movie that John watched as his final wish. This old man is none other than Paul. Paul becomes emotional as he watches the film because it reminds him of John. Paul is now 108 years old and his wife has already passed away. He is living in an old age home where he tells a friend the entire story of John Coffey. However, his friend finds the story impossible to believe. Paul then takes his friend to an old wooden house. Once inside, Paul calls out for Mr. Jingles. Suddenly, the same mouse that Dell named Mr. Jingles appears. The mouse is still alive. When Percy crushed Mr. Jingles under his foot, John had brought him back to life with his supernatural ability. But perhaps while bringing the mouse back to life, John unknowingly transferred a small part of his power to him. That's why Mr. Jingles has survived for so many years. Paul also believes that when he held John's hand before his execution, John transferred part of his power to him as well. This could explain why Paul has lived to the age of 108 and still hasn't died. And now Paul doesn't even know when his own death will finally come. And with this, the movie comes to an end.